Born in Rasinari, Romania in 1911, Emil Cioran emerged from an Orthodox priest's household into a world that would eventually reject everything his father represented, spending his early intellectual years absorbing the works of Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Dostoevsky, until their profound pessimism became the linguistic foundation for expressing his own dawning recognition of life's fundamental inadequacy. This Romanian intellectual, once destined for academic respectability, experienced at age 20 a devastating episode of insomnia that he would later describe as discovering the inconvenience of existence, a moment when consciousness itself became a source of exquisite torture, transforming his relationship with thinking from intellectual liberation to psychological imprisonment that would define his entire philosophical project. What makes Cioran unique is his radical honesty about despair, refusing all consolation while discovering that understanding our inevitable suffering offers the only authentic path to wisdom, making him perhaps the most uncompromisingly honest philosopher who ever lived about the true cost of self-awareness. Why do we suffer simply by being conscious? What happens when awareness becomes a burden rather than a gift? Can wisdom emerge only from confronting life's fundamental inadequacy? These questions drive Cioran's revolutionary insight that existence itself is an inescapable burden of consciousness. What you're about to experience is every major philosophical insight this intellectual prodigy developed as he transformed from promising Romanian scholar to one of the most uncompromisingly honest pessimists in human history, exploring how consciousness transforms from humanity's greatest achievement into its most exquisite torment. Welcome to Sleepy Philosopher, where we explore the most profound ideas in human history slowly enough to truly understand them, tracing how complex philosophical systems develop from specific human experiences and intellectual awakening. If this approach to profound philosophy resonates with you, consider subscribing and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from this exploration of consciousness and despair. Emil Cioran's transformation from promising Romanian intellectual to radical pessimist began with devastating insomnia at age 20, which he later described as discovering the inconvenience of existence, marking not merely a personal crisis, but a philosophical revelation about the fundamental relationship between consciousness and suffering that would become the foundation of his entire worldview. Born in 1911 in Rasinari to an Orthodox priest father who embodied everything Cioran would ultimately reject, his early intellectual awakening came through studying Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Dostoevsky, finding in their works the precise linguistic tools for expressing what he intuitively sensed about life's essential inadequacy, particularly their recognition that self-awareness creates unbearable isolation from natural innocence. His 1934 graduation thesis on Henri Bergson revealed his initial philosophical position by arguing that Bergson fundamentally failed to comprehend life's essential tragedy, marking his definitive break from optimistic philosophical traditions that dominated early 20th century thought and establishing his commitment to philosophical pessimism as the only intellectually honest response to existence. The insomnia that would plague him for life began as a specific crisis of hyperconsciousness, where the very act of thinking became a source of exquisite torture, transforming his relationship with mental activity from liberation to imprisonment, and revealing how self-awareness, rather than enlightening humanity, exposes the unbearable truth that existence itself is fundamentally flawed and absurd. Contemporary manifestations of this crisis appear in our digital age through phenomena like information overload syndrome, where constant connectivity creates similar experiences of mental exhaustion and existential dread, showing how Cioran's insights about consciousness as burden apply to modern conditions where technological mediation amplifies rather than alleviates the torment of hyper-awareness that he identified as fundamental to human existence. Cioran's most fundamental discovery was that consciousness transforms from humanity's celebrated advantage into an insidious curse, revealing how self-awareness operates as the mechanism through which existence reveals its inherent inadequacy and absurdity to the thoughtful individual. This represents perhaps the most devastating insight of modern philosophy, for it reveals that what we consider our greatest gift, our capacity for reflection, choice, and understanding, becomes precisely the source of our deepest torment. Unlike simple suffering or unhappiness, the burden of consciousness creates a state where awareness itself becomes unbearable because it forces recognition of life's fundamental meaninglessness, temporal limitations, and the inevitable gap between human aspirations and reality's indifference. This consciousness operates through what Cioran called the terror of existing, where each moment of clear thinking amplifies awareness of mortality, futility, and the absurd disconnect between human dreams and cosmic reality. The psychological mechanism involves consciousness creating an internal observer that monitors every experience, relationship, and achievement with devastating clarity about its ultimate inadequacy and temporary nature. This observer functions as an autonomous psychological entity that cannot be silenced or turned off, constantly analyzing, judging, and exposing the gap between what we desire and what actually exists. Unlike external criticism, this internal surveillance operates with perfect knowledge of our deepest fears and limitations, making it far more devastating than any external judgment could ever be. The operational mechanisms of this consciousness burden reveal themselves in several interconnected processes that create a self-perpetuating cycle of awareness and despair. First, consciousness generates an endless stream of questions that cannot be answered satisfactorily. Why do we exist? What is the point of our efforts? How do we bear the knowledge of our mortality? Second, it creates comparative awareness that makes contentment impossible by constantly measuring our current situation against both idealized possibilities and the experiences of others. Third, it produces temporal consciousness that prevents us from living purely in the present by constantly referencing past failures and future anxieties. Each of these mechanisms operates independently yet reinforces the others, creating what Cioran termed an inescapable web of awareness, from which traditional consolations provide only temporary relief. In contemporary culture, this manifests in the widespread phenomena of modern anxiety, depression, and existential crisis, where individuals, despite unprecedented material comfort and technological advancement, experience what Cioran predicted with unsettling accuracy. Consciousness that cannot be turned off becomes a source of perpetual torment, making even successful lives feel fundamentally hollow and meaningless. Social media amplifies this burden by creating constant comparison with others, curated presentations of their lives, while 24-hour news cycles maintain awareness of global disasters and injustices. The accessibility of unlimited information paradoxically increases the terror of existing by making the scope of human problems and limitations impossible to ignore or forget, creating a generation that understands too much about reality's indifference to find peace in willful ignorance. Understanding this burden of consciousness reveals why traditional philosophical and religious consolations ultimately fail to provide lasting relief, for they attempt to disguise or minimize the very awareness that creates the problem. Cioran's insight suggests that liberation comes not through escaping consciousness, but through fully accepting its terrible gift. Understanding that the path to any genuine wisdom requires walking through the valley of existential despair rather than attempting to circumvent it. This creates the paradoxical foundation for what he would later develop as his philosophy of therapeutic pessimism, where embracing the full burden of awareness becomes the prerequisite for any authentic engagement with existence. Cioran's most revolutionary insight emerged from his recognition that despair represents not psychological pathology, but the most authentic form of human existence, arguing that genuine despair constitutes honest recognition of reality, while happiness and hope function as elaborate forms of spiritual exhaustion and self-deception. This paradoxical perspective arose from his own profound insomnia and the devastating discovery of what he called the inconvenience of existence, experiences that convinced him authentic despair operates as philosophical enlightenment rather than mere suffering. Through this lens, Cioran positioned despair as superior to happiness, because despair maintains intellectual integrity while happiness relies on protective illusions that shield humans from unbearable truths about existence's fundamental structure. The theoretical framework of authentic despair rests upon Cioran's distinction between what he termed lucidity and the protective mechanisms of hope and consolation that prevent genuine confrontation with reality. Lucidity represents the disciplined commitment to seeing existence without the softening filters of optimism, religious consolation, or philosophical system building that traditionally shield humanity from existential truths. This authentic despair differs fundamentally from clinical depression because it involves active intellectual engagement with existence's fundamental problems rather than passive suffering, creating what Cioran conceptualized as a form of spiritual aristocracy, where only those brave enough to face despair directly achieve genuine philosophical wisdom and authentic self-understanding. The mechanism of despair's authenticating power functions through systematic exposure to what Cioran called the scandal of existence. The recognition that consciousness, rather than being humanity's greatest gift, transforms into its most exquisite form of torment through the inevitable awareness of life's irreducible difficulties. This process operates through sustained confrontation with life's fundamental problems without resolution, developing what Cioran termed philosophical courage, the willingness to maintain lucidity despite discovering that existence offers no ultimate answers or consolations. The authentic despair that emerges maintains intellectual integrity by refusing the comfort of false solutions, while developing what Cioran saw as sovereign indifference to life's inevitable disappointments and betrayals. Contemporary applications of Cioran's insight reveal themselves most prominently in therapeutic approaches that emphasize acceptance of fundamental existential realities rather than immediate resolution of psychological distress, particularly in existential therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy that help individuals embrace rather than fight life's irreducible difficulties. Literary and artistic movements demonstrate similar patterns through works that embrace meaninglessness as source of authentic expression rather than desperate search for consolation, while philosophical traditions increasingly reject easy answers in favor of sustaining, productive confrontation with life's fundamental challenges. Corporate wellness programs and mental health initiatives that focus on building psychological resilience through honest acknowledgement of life's difficulties rather than purely positive thinking represent practical manifestations of Cioran's authentic despair. The integrative implications of understanding despair as authentic existence extend beyond individual psychology to create fundamental shifts in how humans relate to reality itself, establishing despair as the foundation for genuine spiritual wisdom rather than psychological failure. This perspective transforms the traditional understanding of pessimism from negative emotional state into positive philosophical achievement that enables authentic relationships with existence's actual structure rather than humanity's wishful projections about meaning and purpose. Such recognition prepares us for Cioran's subsequent exploration of how self-awareness creates unbearable isolation, revealing how the very consciousness that generates authentic despair simultaneously ensures profound existential loneliness that no philosophical system or therapeutic approach can ultimately resolve. Cioran's concept of existence as exile represents perhaps his most penetrating insight into the human condition, revealing that consciousness creates an irreversible separation from the pre-reflective immediacy that characterized our earliest experience of being. This exile operates through what he termed the curse of knowing, where each moment of conscious awareness accumulates experiences that establish psychological distance from the spontaneous participation in life that defined childhood and animal existence. Unlike temporary alienation, this condition becomes permanent once awakened, creating an unbridgeable gap between thinking beings and authentic being itself, trapping humanity in permanent alienation from both nature and immediate reality. The theoretical framework of this exile centers on consciousness's fundamental relationship to memory and reflection, where each act of awareness accumulates psychological baggage that cannot be forgotten or returned. Memory operates not merely as storage of past events, but as a force that transforms present experience by making it available for conscious analysis and critique. Reflection creates distance between subject and object, observer and observed, preventing the unmediated participation that characterized pre-conscious existence. This mechanism works through consciousness, continually questioning, analyzing and critiquing every experience, establishing a permanent state of psychological homelessness where immediate, unreflective engagement with reality becomes impossible. The operational mechanisms of exile manifest through consciousness's relentless questioning of experience, where the thinking mind cannot rest in simple acceptance of phenomena as they present themselves. Understanding how things really work, mortality's inevitability, social mechanisms, arbitrariness, value systems, constructed nature, makes impossible the spontaneous joy and faith available only to the unaware. This process involves consciousness perpetually standing outside immediate experience, observing, analyzing, and critiquing rather than participating authentically. The exile becomes particularly acute as understanding increases, creating psychological barriers between conscious beings and the unreflective simplicity that characterized pre-conscious existence. Contemporary manifestations of consciousness's exile appear in widespread nostalgia for childhood simplicity and rural authenticity, reflecting humanity's recognition that increased knowledge has created unavoidable distance from unmediated experience. The immense popularity of mindfulness practices represents collective attempts to bypass consciousness and return to present moment immediacy that adults have largely lost through reflective awareness. Advanced technological societies demonstrate Cioran's prediction that increased capability and knowledge coincide with widespread depression and meaninglessness. As consciousness's burden becomes more acute rather than more manageable, professional wellness programs increasingly acknowledge that honest acknowledgement of existence's limitations provides more authentic relief than forced positivity or easy consolations. Understanding consciousness as exile reveals that wisdom emerges not through escape from awareness, but through full acknowledgement of consciousness's inevitable burden and permanent separation from innocence. This recognition provides liberation by eliminating the exhausting struggle to recover lost simplicity and focusing attention instead on authentic engagement with existence as it actually is. The exile of consciousness becomes not a curse to overcome, but the fundamental condition through which authentic wisdom becomes possible. As only through complete acceptance of consciousness's limitations can genuine understanding of human nature and reality emerge. Cioran's most penetrating insight emerged from his recognition that time and mortality constitute the fundamental architecture of human anxiety, creating psychological structures that transform our brief existence into an elaborate strategizing exercise against inevitable ending. This temporal consciousness operates through what he termed the acceleration of dread, a mechanism whereby each passing moment simultaneously brings the comfort of death closer, while compounding the burden of accumulated experiences that can never be undone or authentically repeated. As we established in previous discussions, Cioran understood consciousness as inherently burdensome, but time reveals how this burden operates dynamically across our entire lifespan, creating systematic anxiety that penetrates every aspect of conscious experience. The philosophical significance lies in recognizing that time is not merely a container for events, but an active psychological force that shapes how we experience reality itself. The theoretical framework of Cioran's temporal anxiety centers on what he identified as consciousness, creating internal narrative mappings between past regrets and future anxieties, generating a form of mental time travel that prevents full presence in the only actual moment available, the immediate present. This mechanism operates through what Cioran saw as the fundamental temporal paradox of consciousness. While animals live in permanent present tense, human awareness creates psychological projections both backward into memory and forward into anticipation, effectively destroying authentic temporal existence. The theoretical structure reveals how temporality consciousness functions as a systematic psychological burden, because each moment of awareness necessarily contains within it the full weight of temporal responsibility. Decisions made in the past create regrets that poison present experience, while awareness of future mortality transforms every present action into potential source of later regret. This creates what Cioran termed the temporal vice of consciousness, where human awareness becomes trapped between unchangeable past and uncontrollable future, with the present moment serving only as a staging ground for this temporal suffering. The operational mechanisms of temporal anxiety manifest through consciousness, creating what Cioran called decision paralysis through temporal regret projection, where the awareness of mortality transforms every choice into potential source of future regret, creating what psychologists now recognize as decision-making anxiety that prevents authentic engagement with immediate experience. This operates through systematic mental processes where consciousness automatically generates scenarios of future regret based on present decisions, effectively preventing authentic freedom of action while creating chronic anxiety about potential outcomes. The mechanism also involves what Cioran identified as temporal accumulation syndrome, where each passing experience becomes psychologically catalogued according to whether it represents time well spent or time wasted, creating an internal judge that continuously evaluates all experience against standards of future productivity. Additionally, the mechanism includes what Cioran called anticipatory mourning, where consciousness begins grieving for future losses of relationships, abilities, and opportunities before they actually occur, creating present suffering for anticipated future endings. These processes work together to transform temporal awareness from simple chronological awareness into an active source of psychological torment that operates continuously throughout conscious experience. Contemporary applications of Cioran's temporal anxiety insights manifest powerfully in modern productivity culture, where what he called chronophobia, The fear of wasting time has become so pervasive that many individuals report feeling more paralyzed by time pressure than by actual mortality itself. This manifests in phenomena such as the busyness epidemic, where individuals fill schedules with activities not because they find them meaningful, but because empty time represents existential terror about temporal waste. Therapeutic approaches increasingly recognize what Cioran identified as temporal anxiety disorders, where the fundamental issue is not depression or generalized anxiety, but specifically the psychological burden created by temporal consciousness. Professional wellness programs now address time-related stress as a core mental health issue, while individuals struggling with productivity guilt represent a form of temporal anxiety, where every moment not spent on seemingly meaningful work becomes source of self-reproach. The digital age has amplified this through what Cioran would have recognized as temporal acceleration syndrome, where constant connectivity and information flow create pressure to utilize time more efficiently than human psychology can realistically accommodate. Dating applications that encourage rapid relationship decisions, social media platforms that create awareness of others, constantly optimized experiences, and workplace cultures that measure human worth through measurable productivity all represent systematic applications of temporal pressure that Cioran identified as fundamental sources of modern psychological suffering. The deeper integrative implications of understanding time as the foundation of anxiety reveal how Cioran's insights illuminate why conscious existence systematically generates more suffering than satisfaction, despite humanity's best efforts to organize life around meaning, achievement, and relationship. This understanding shows that the apparent problem with modern life, that despite unprecedented material comfort and technological advancement, anxiety and depression rates continue rising, reflects the fundamental limitation of attempting to solve temporal anxiety through material or psychological strategies that do not address the root cause. Cioran's temporal analysis demonstrates that every philosophical system, therapeutic approach, and practical life strategy must either acknowledge and work with the reality of temporal anxiety or remain fundamentally ineffective because it fails to address the structural reality of conscious existence. The insight also reveals why traditional consolations, whether religious, philosophical, or psychological, ultimately provide only temporary relief, because they cannot eliminate the temporal conditions that create anxiety in the first place. However, this same insight offers profound liberation by showing that accepting temporal anxiety as fundamental to conscious experience allows individuals to stop fighting their own psychological architecture and instead develop authentic wisdom about how to live within temporal limitations. The synthesis reveals that Cioran's temporal insights complete his earlier insights about consciousness and despair, showing that awareness of temporality does not represent a separate problem, but represents the deepest mechanism through which consciousness becomes the burden we explored in previous discussions. Emil Cioran's critique of historical progress represents one of his most devastating revelations about human consciousness, demonstrating how our capacity for awareness becomes a sophisticated instrument of self-deception that allows us to believe in advancement while fundamental patterns of suffering, violence, and meaninglessness remain constant across all technological and social change. Having established how consciousness creates unbearable self-awareness and how despair reveals authentic existence, Cioran now reveals the most insidious mechanism of consciousness: its systematic ability to create the illusion that human condition is improving, when in reality the core structural problems of mortality, suffering, and meaninglessness remain fundamentally unchanged. This represents perhaps the cruelest irony of consciousness, that while it grants us the ability to accumulate knowledge and create increasingly sophisticated tools for improving our circumstances, It simultaneously generates elaborate illusions that shield us from recognizing consciousness's fundamental incapacity to resolve existence's basic contradictions. The intellectual stakes here are profound, because understanding this illusion of progress becomes essential for recognizing why, despite accumulating vast knowledge and technological capabilities, human beings continue to experience the same fundamental anxieties, despair, and sense of meaninglessness that have characterized every historical period. The theoretical foundation of Cioran's critique rests upon what he termed temporal optimism, a systematic psychological bias that predisposes consciousness toward believing the present moment represents humanity's peak development, while characterizing the past as embodying primitive mistakes that superior modern consciousness has supposedly overcome. This temporal optimism operates through consciousness's selective memory mechanisms, which unconsciously suppress evidence of recurring patterns while emphasizing moments of advancement in technology, social organization, and material comfort. The theoretical framework reveals how consciousness creates hierarchical distinctions between historical periods, positioning contemporary existence as the culmination of progressive development while dismissing previous eras as crude preliminaries to our current sophistication. Cioran observed that this bias is so fundamental to consciousness's structure that it operates even in individuals who claim to understand history's cyclical nature, suggesting that temporal optimism represents not merely intellectual error, but consciousness's essential defensive mechanism against confronting existence's unchanging, tragic structure. The theoretical insight reveals that consciousness's relationship to time is not neutral observation, but active construction of narratives that serve psychological comfort rather than accurate representation of reality's patterns. The operational mechanisms of temporal optimism function through consciousness's selective attention and memory systems, which systematically emphasize evidence of advancement in technology, social organization, and material comfort, while unconsciously suppressing evidence that fundamental human problems of mortality, suffering, violence, and meaninglessness remain constant across all historical periods. This mechanism operates by creating what Cioran called progress amnesia, the psychological inability to maintain simultaneous awareness of technological advancement and the persistence of consciousness's basic structural problems. The process involves consciousness constructing elaborate narratives that attribute contemporary human suffering to residual primitive elements that superior modern consciousness will eventually overcome, while ignoring evidence that such suffering emerges from consciousness's essential relationship to existence rather than from environmental or technological limitations. The operational pattern includes selective historical memory that emphasizes moments of advancement while minimizing patterns of recurring violence, oppression, and existential despair that persist across all technological and social changes. This mechanism functions as consciousness's primary defense against recognizing its fundamental incapacity to resolve existence's basic contradictions, creating the illusion that current problems represent temporary obstacles to ultimate progress rather than permanent features of conscious existence. Contemporary manifestations of temporal optimism appear throughout modern culture through widespread belief in inevitable technological solutions to fundamental human problems, faith that increasing knowledge automatically produces wisdom, and assumption that historical awareness prevents repetition of past mistakes despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In the digital age, this appears as belief that artificial intelligence will resolve human cognitive limitations. Social media will create authentic global community, and scientific advancement will eliminate disease and aging, despite mortality remaining consciousness's defining condition. Corporate environments demonstrate temporal optimism through productivity cultures that assume increased efficiency leads to human fulfillment. Wellness programs that treat mental health as technical problem solvable through proper techniques, and educational systems that treat knowledge accumulation as path to wisdom, despite evidence that sophisticated individuals experience identical existential problems to their less educated predecessors. Contemporary politics operates through temporal optimism by positioning current disagreements as expressions of superior modern values rather than recognition that political conflicts arise from consciousness's fundamental relationship to power, authority, and meaning-making. Even therapeutic approaches often embody temporal optimism by treating depression and anxiety as medical conditions that proper intervention can eliminate rather than recognizing them as consciousness's natural responses to existence's structural contradictions. The deeper implications of Cioran's insight reveal consciousness's tragic structural limitation. While it possesses unlimited capacity to accumulate information and create increasingly sophisticated tools for improving external circumstances, it cannot overcome the basic problems that emerge from consciousness's fundamental relationship to reality: mortality, meaninglessness, suffering, and the unavoidable confrontation with existence's apparent pointlessness. This limitation makes all human progress fundamentally superficial improvement of circumstances rather than transformation of consciousness's essential relation to existence, meaning that technological advancement and social progress represent elaborate forms of environmental modification that fail to address consciousness's core condition. Understanding this limitation reveals why periods of greatest technological advancement often coincide with widespread depression, anxiety, and existential crisis, demonstrating that improving circumstances cannot resolve consciousness's fundamental structural problems. The insight suggests that authentic wisdom emerges not from belief in progress, but from recognition that consciousness's most sophisticated achievements ultimately represent sophisticated methods of avoiding confrontation with existence's unchanging tragic structure, making the illusion of progress consciousness's most elaborate and dangerous form of self-deception. Cioran's ethic of inaction represents his most sophisticated practical application of pessimistic philosophy, transforming the recognition of life's fundamental absurdity into a revolutionary ethical framework that challenges conventional wisdom about virtue and productivity. Building upon his earlier insights about consciousness as burden and despair as authentic existence, Cioran argues that traditional moral systems placing value on active engagement with existence miss the deeper truth about consciousness's inescapable participation in suffering and meaninglessness. This principle emerges directly from his philosophical pessimism. If existence itself is fundamentally flawed and all participation in life perpetuates unnecessary suffering, then restraint and non-interference become the highest forms of wisdom available to conscious beings. The intellectual stakes involve nothing less than redefining what constitutes ethical behavior in light of pessimistic philosophical insights. The theoretical foundation rests on what Cioran termed the virtue of futility, understanding that all human endeavors participate in existence's basic meaninglessness, making the traditional distinction between important and unimportant actions ultimately irrelevant to life's essential structure. This concept emerges from his observation that consciousness, once awakened to despair, cannot return to the unconscious participation that characterizes naive existence. The virtue of futility operates through recognition that even beneficial activities participate in larger patterns of suffering and delusion, since they maintain individuals within the conscious experience of existence's fundamental absurdity. Cioran argued that traditional virtues like productivity, achievement, and social engagement actually represent forms of spiritual blindness, evidence that consciousness has not yet confronted the full implications of its own existence. The ethical framework therefore prioritizes minimal participation in existence's generally destructive processes, while avoiding the nihilistic trap of complete withdrawal. The operational mechanism involves consciousness recognizing how even beneficial activities participate in larger patterns of suffering and delusion, creating ethical obligation to minimize one's participation while avoiding paralysis through what Cioran called philosophical patience. This patience operates through sophisticated discrimination between necessary and unnecessary activities based on existential rather than practical criteria. Individuals developing this wisdom learn to distinguish between actions that genuinely reduce suffering and those that merely participate in existence's generally chaotic patterns. The mechanism requires ongoing vigilance against the seductions of productivity culture and achievement-oriented thinking, while maintaining sufficient engagement with life to avoid complete withdrawal. Philosophical patience manifests as the ability to act only when action clearly reduces suffering rather than contributes to existence's typically destructive processes, creating lifestyle that embodies pessimistic insights without descending into hopelessness. This wisdom appears in contemporary practices like voluntary simplicity movements, where individuals consciously reduce consumption and activity levels, not for environmental reasons, but from philosophical recognition that participation in economic systems perpetuates unnecessary suffering. Philosophical approaches to therapy now emphasize acceptance over change, teaching clients to distinguish between necessary and unnecessary life activities based on existential rather than practical criteria, directly reflecting Cioran's insight that traditional therapeutic approaches often miss deeper existential realities. Minimalist living practices represent another manifestation, where individuals reduce material possessions and commitments not for efficiency but from recognition that most activities participate in existence's fundamental futility. Corporate wellness programs increasingly incorporate concepts from this philosophy, emphasizing that some presentations may require philosophical rather than technical solutions. While therapeutic methods, teaching philosophical patience, help individuals navigate modern life without abandoning contemplative insight. Understanding Cioran's ethic of inaction provides crucial insight into how pessimistic philosophy transforms from theoretical insight into practical wisdom, revealing that authentic pessimism does not lead to paralysis, but to sophisticated discrimination about ethical action. This principle connects his earlier insights about consciousness and despair into a comprehensive worldview that offers practical guidance for navigating existence without denying philosophical insights about life's fundamental structure. The wisdom of inaction ultimately demonstrates that recognizing life's absurdity can paradoxically create more authentic engagement with existence, not through forced positivity, but through honest acknowledgement of limitations that paradoxically enables more genuine action when action is genuinely needed. Cioran's most controversial philosophical insight emerges from recognizing suffering as the definitive marker of authentic consciousness, establishing what he termed the aristocracy of the awakened, those individuals who remain unprotected by ignorance, optimism, or systematic self-deception. This aristocratic suffering operates through what Cioran called lucrific consciousness, where clear perception automatically generates psychological pain because reality systematically reveals itself as fundamentally inadequate to human aspirations and consciousness's inherent expectations about meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. The mechanism reveals consciousness experiencing torment not from external circumstances, but from internal confrontation with existence's true structural limitations, making sophisticated and thoughtful individuals necessarily more suffering than those who remain protected by philosophical consolations or practical distractions. The theoretical framework centers on Cioran's distinction between authentic and inauthentic forms of consciousness, where authentic awareness necessarily involves suffering because it recognizes existence's fundamental mismatch with human psychological needs for meaning, purpose, and significance. This outlucrific consciousness operates through a logical progression where increased awareness of reality's structure automatically decreases capacity for philosophical consolations, optimistic self-deception, and practical distractions, resulting in direct confrontation with existence's existential inadequacies. The aristocracy of the awakened describes individuals who have achieved sufficient intellectual and emotional development to recognize the gap between consciousness's aspirations and reality's actual structure, while those who remain protected by ignorance, systematic optimism, or philosophical system building avoid this confrontation and thus remain spiritually inferior despite their apparent psychological comfort. The operational mechanisms manifest through consciousness's progressive development toward what Cioran termed lucrific awareness, where each stage of intellectual and emotional sophistication eliminates more forms of self-deception while simultaneously revealing deeper levels of reality's inadequacy to human psychological requirements. This suffering operates not as pathology or dysfunction, but as the inevitable result of consciousness developing sufficient clarity to perceive existence's fundamental mismatch with human aspirations for meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. The mechanism functions through consciousness, recognizing that reality offers neither the stable meanings nor the ultimate consolations that sophisticated psychological development seeks, creating what Cioran described as an irreversible intellectual condition, where increased awareness necessarily correlates with increased suffering rather than increased wisdom or happiness. Contemporary applications appear through recognition that highly educated and thoughtful individuals in modern technological societies often experience more psychological distress, anxiety, and existential crisis than those with simpler educational backgrounds or less sophisticated intellectual development. This pattern emerges through philosophers, academics, therapists, and writers who discover that increased knowledge and awareness correlate with decreased capacity for traditional consolations, optimistic self-deception, and practical distractions that previously provided psychological comfort. The therapeutic and philosophical movements that validate suffering as potentially transformative rather than purely pathological experience reflect Cioran's insights about productive versus destructive suffering, where some forms of psychological pain serve authentic developmental functions, while others merely perpetuate additional suffering without providing deeper self-knowledge or spiritual insight. The practical wisdom involves learning to distinguish between productive suffering that reveals existential truth and destructive suffering that merely generates additional psychological torment without corresponding self-knowledge or authentic insight into consciousness's actual relationship with reality's structure. This distinction enables sophisticated individuals to navigate consciousness's inevitable pain as a source of authentic self-knowledge and spiritual development, rather than treating suffering as something to be eliminated through pharmaceutical intervention, philosophical consolations, or practical distractions that would restore ignorance while sacrificing intellectual honesty about existence's fundamental inadequacies to human psychological requirements for meaning and purpose. Emil Cioran's philosophical predictions demonstrate extraordinary accuracy in forecasting the fundamental contradictions of contemporary culture, particularly his insight that advanced societies would achieve unprecedented material abundance while simultaneously experiencing widespread existential meaninglessness. Writing in the 1940s and 1950s, when technological advancement seemed like an unmitigated good, Cioran predicted that consciousness would evolve from humanity's celebrated gift into a source of psychological torment that sophisticated knowledge could not resolve. His forecast that traditional sources of meaning, religion, progress narratives, and philosophical consolations would collapse under the scrutiny of clear thinking rather than offering genuine solutions to existential problems appears remarkably prescient when viewed through the lens of current cultural conditions. This prophetic dimension of Cioran's work reveals how his personal torment translated into intellectual insights about collective human experiences that would emerge decades after his initial observations. The theoretical framework underlying Cioran's cultural predictions rests on his understanding that consciousness operates according to internal contradictions that become more pronounced as societies develop greater intellectual sophistication. His core insight holds that human awareness generates problems faster than it can create solutions, creating what he termed the inconvenience of existence. The realization that thought processes designed to help humans navigate reality simultaneously make existence more unbearable through increased self-awareness. Traditional meaning systems function as psychological protections against this fundamental insight. But sophisticated thinking inevitably exposes these protections as inadequate illusions. Cioran argued that advanced cultures would experience what he called consolation paralysis, the inability of traditional philosophical and religious frameworks to provide genuine comfort to minds that have seen through their explanatory limitations. This theoretical foundation explains why contemporary societies, despite having access to more information and therapeutic resources than any previous generation, experience unprecedented levels of anxiety and existential crisis. Cioran's influence manifests across multiple contemporary domains through specific operational mechanisms that demonstrate how his philosophical predictions continue to unfold in practice. In existential psychology, practitioners increasingly recognize that meaning-making functions as a psychological need rather than an objective reality, adopting therapeutic approaches that help individuals accept life's inherent meaninglessness rather than fight against it. Postmodern literature and artistic movements embrace absurdity as a fundamental condition of human experience rather than a temporary social dysfunction that could be corrected through improved conditions. Contemporary therapeutic approaches, including various forms of acceptance-based therapy, help clients navigate existence's fundamental inadequacies rather than attempting to eliminate suffering through purely technical interventions. Philosophical counseling movements recognize that consciousness creates problems it cannot solve, requiring intellectual frameworks that accommodate rather than zabie life's essential inadequacies. These operational mechanisms appear in corporate wellness programs that emphasize honest acknowledgement of existence's limitations over forced positivity, educational approaches that teach philosophical patience rather than simple knowledge accumulation, and therapeutic methods that validate suffering as potentially transformative rather than purely pathological. Contemporary cultural phenomena demonstrate the practical relevance of Cioran's insights through specific manifestations of the meaning crisis he predicted. Advanced technological societies simultaneously achieve remarkable capability in areas like artificial intelligence, space exploration, and medical advancement, while experiencing unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and existential crisis that manifest in phenomena like temporal anxiety disorders, productivity guilt epidemics, and the widespread popularity of mindfulness practices as collective attempts to bypass reflective consciousness. Digital communication networks provide instant access to global information, while amplifying existential awareness through constant exposure to suffering, injustice, and the scope of human problems that no individual can resolve. Educational systems that emphasize critical thinking paradoxically create populations more capable of recognizing life's fundamental inadequacies, while providing fewer traditional consolations for this increased awareness. Professional wellness programs increasingly recognize that corporate productivity cultures generate meaninglessness rather than fulfillment, requiring approaches that address existential rather than merely technical aspects of workplace stress. These contemporary applications reveal how Cioran's predictions about consciousness creating problems it cannot solve continue to manifest in increasingly sophisticated ways. The ongoing relevance of Cioran's insights emerges through recognition that his philosophical framework provides essential intellectual tools for understanding the paradoxical conditions of advanced cultures, where remarkable technological achievement coincides with widespread existential distress. His work illuminates why sophisticated societies require philosophical approaches that accommodate rather than zeby life's fundamental inadequacies, explaining the current popularity of philosophical counseling, acceptance-based therapeutic methods, and intellectual traditions that embrace rather than overcome pessimism as legitimate forms of wisdom. Contemporary movements toward voluntary simplicity, minimalist living practices, and reduction of consumption represent practical applications of Cioran's insight that participation in technological progress often involves complicity in systemic suffering that consciousness cannot resolve. His predictions about the collapse of traditional consolations explain why modern populations simultaneously have access to unprecedented levels of psychological and philosophical resources while experiencing more existential crisis than previous generations. Understanding Cioran's framework provides crucial perspective for navigating contemporary life, revealing why technological advancement without corresponding philosophical development creates the conditions for the meaning crisis he foretold, and suggesting that wisdom requires acknowledgement of existence's fundamental inadequacies rather than optimism about our ability to transcend them through improved conditions or increased knowledge. Cioran's ultimate philosophical synthesis reveals that pessimistic understanding represents humanity's greatest liberation rather than its ultimate defeat. Through decades of confronting the fundamental inadequacies of existence, Cioran discovered that consciousness creates an inescapable burden, but that burden, when fully acknowledged and accepted, transforms from torture into wisdom. This integration emerges from the recognition that all his previous insights, consciousness as the source of existential burden, despair as the revelation of authentic being, and the exile that makes return to innocence impossible, interconnect as a coherent system revealing existence's true structure. The burden becomes liberating precisely because it eliminates impossible expectations while creating space for authentic engagement with reality based on clear seeing rather than hopeful delusion. The theoretical framework of this synthesis operates through what Cioran called philosophical maturity, the ability to live with clear understanding of existence's structure while maintaining practical engagement with life's demands without expecting these activities to provide ultimate meaning or resolution. This involves recognizing how consciousness creates burden, how burden generates despair, how despair reveals authentic existence, how authentic existence demands intellectual honesty, and how intellectual honesty requires accepting rather than overcoming life's fundamental problems. Rather than seeking to eliminate suffering through elaborate systems of meaning, Philosophical maturity embraces suffering as both inevitable and potentially instructive. The framework rejects the false choice between withdrawing from existence entirely or maintaining false hope. Instead, finding a middle path of clear-eyed participation without illusion. The operational mechanisms of this liberation emerge through distinguishing between necessary and unnecessary suffering, creating life practices based on acceptance rather than transformation, and developing ethical frameworks that minimize participation in existence's destructive patterns without requiring complete withdrawal from human activities. Contemporary therapeutic approaches that emphasize acceptance over change reflect this mechanism, helping individuals recognize which aspects of existence can be modified and which must be accepted. These practices involve cultivating what Cioran described as therapeutic despair, the deliberate acknowledgement of life's fundamental inadequacy as the foundation for authentic peace. Rather than fighting reality's structure through constant optimization and improvement projects, this approach accepts reality's limitations while engaging meaningfully with whatever elements remain within human control. Contemporary applications of this synthesis appear in movements toward voluntary simplicity, where individuals consciously reduce consumption and complexity based on recognition of life's fundamental futility rather than mere environmental concern. Corporate wellness programs increasingly incorporate philosophical rather than technical solutions, emphasizing honest acknowledgement of existence's limitations over forced positivity and productivity optimization. Educational approaches, teaching philosophical patience rather than mere knowledge accumulation, reflect understanding that increased information without corresponding wisdom increases rather than decreases existential burden. Therapeutic methods emphasize helping clients distinguish between problems that can be solved and realities that must be accepted, creating possibility for authentic peace through understanding rather than through elaborate systems of hope and meaning that consciousness cannot ultimately sustain. The integrative implications of Cioran's pessimistic philosophy reveal it as ultimately life-affirming because it accepts rather than fights reality's structure, creating possibility for authentic peace through understanding rather than through hope-based systems that consciousness inevitably undermines. This synthesis demonstrates how Cioran's work provides not despair, but liberation. Liberation from impossible obligations to find ultimate meaning. Liberation from the tyranny of constant improvement and optimization. And liberation into authentic engagement with existence based on clear recognition of what is and what cannot be changed. The pessimistic wisdom becomes the foundation for genuine human flourishing, precisely because it eliminates false expectations while preserving the possibility for meaningful action within existence's actual boundaries. In embracing the heights of despair, Cioran reveals not humanity's ultimate tragedy, but its ultimate freedom,